Hi everyone, welcome to Adobe Live Pro Tips. My name is Cyn Lagos. I'm a graphic designer, a photographer, and aspiring filmmaker. Thank you again for joining us today if you're coming back from yesterday's stream. Today we're going to talk about the grading tool in Lightroom, so that's going to be a lot of fun. So let's dive in and take a look. All right, I'm in Adobe Lightroom, and this might look a little bit different. Don't fear. I have my photos here, but this is something that I want to use to showcase a little bit what the grading tool actually does, right? Because we have a couple of color tools here. We've explored yesterday the color mixer tool with the target adjustment specifically, and that was a lot of fun. We were able to target different color palettes within our images and take away that guesswork of having to find out which color is represented in the slider. So that was a lot of fun. So definitely check that out. Today, we're going to go a little bit lower here on the color grading tool, still in our color panel. And I want to start by showing you the midtones, shadows, and highlights that are reflected here. So I have this representation of the shadows, midtones, and highlights. So you can see how this panel gets affected, right? So we have the midtones, shadows, and highlights here, and each one has a slider to determine the strength. What I want to show you is color grading is a little bit different from the other tools that we've been exploring because the color grading for me, in my workflow, is oftentimes a step of creativity. I'm trying to add a color, not so much find a color, but add a color. So that's the way I like to approach it. But overall, what it does is it affects different tonal ranges within your image. So the ranges between shadows, midtones, and highlights gets affected. And to demonstrate that, I'm going to go into the global tool here, and you can see it's the last little bubble that begins here. So we were just here on the third one, and we're going to go all the way to the end. So you can see a global edit. All right. So let's say, for example, I want to add a kind of a warm hue into my image. You can see here that when I add this red hue, it gets applied to everything. Now, if you think about it, adding a color to a completely black tone is not really going to be very different. In the same way that adding a color to a completely white tone is not going to be that different. And this is often why when we're photographing or we're out actually taking these images, we want to make sure we don't have completely white peaks in our images, right? Because we can't do anything to them in post, right? They don't get affected, or any shadow, any really completely black shadows, they just won't get affected. But anything in between, you can start to see that it acquires a little bit of that red hue that I just included here, right? So let's say, for example, I want to add a little bit of blue in this too, and this is sort of the way it will be affected. You see the midtones have a gray tonality beneath them, and then the highlights have that white tonality. So you can see that this looks a bit more pastel, and then it starts getting darker from there. And that gives you such a really interesting range of a color palette. This isn't a primary blue, although what I'm selecting is pretty much a primary blue, right? But you can see how the colors that are beneath it begin to really blend in and begin to affect that. Now, if you look down a little bit in here, you have the hue, saturation, and the luminance, much like we were exploring yesterday in the target adjustment tool. We had these three different properties to play with. The hue meaning the color palette in essence, right? And then we have the saturation, which really means how much of that color you're really applying. And then the luminance deals with the lightness of that color. So I like to go into this little bar here to just see the sliders. So now I have my sliders available, which is, I think, more visual and more effective if I want to be very specific to a color palette. So here I can start to see the different hues that I can select. And of course, just like we have explored before, you can see that whenever we affect the slider, other visual graphics also get affected. So we can determine where we want to be. So obviously these are kind of different ways of doing it. You can choose your favorite way. I like kind of playing around and moving this dot around in the color wheel to sort of find the color that I want. But from time to time, I'll jump in here. But I do think it's far more effective than dialing in a few numbers here, unless you're kind of just creating that small change. Maybe you don't want too strong of a red. You want a little bit of a warmer tone, so it affects your image a little bit different. So that's when you start to kind of dial in those numbers. Okay, so that is how that global color palette gets affected on the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights. So now that we know that, I want to show you what happens. And a pro tip here, in order to keep up with all of my different edits, something that I often do in Lightroom, which is one of my favorite things ever since it came out, is I like using versions. It's all the way down here. If you're on your iPad, I believe it's on the right-hand side. So I'm going to click on versions here. And versions gives me different, basically an option to save all the different edits and experimentations that I'm making along the way. So I have my original here. So I'm going to click on original to just go back. If I wanted to save something, I just click that plus button and name it whatever I want along the way. So you'll see me do that a couple of times on my images. I'm going to go to your original here and see how that is reflecting. Cool. So let's go back to our color grading. Let's click X there. And this time I'm actually going to go into, we love diving deeper and deeper into a tool. So I'm going to go directly into my shadows panel. So now this wheel is representing my shadows only. So whatever color I select here will be affected on anything that has that shadow range, right? So you can see that anything within that shadow all the way to sort of the middle area of the midtones starts to get affected, but not so much all the way to the highlights, right? So that's a really cool way to specify or add a bit of sass to your shadows, as opposed to just leaving them black, right? So we've often seen this reflected in film, in different types of film where the shadows are green or the shadows are slightly purple. So if you want to imitate that, which we will play around in our images soon enough, you can do that by doing this within your shadows, your midtones, and your highlights. So you might be familiar with this. This used to be called split toning, where you select color in your shadows. For example, say I select a blue, right? And then we go over to our midtones. I could click this little hint of a bubble here, or I can go directly into my midtones in this middle circle. And I'm going to pick a color in the opposite side of the color wheel. So I picked a blue, which is on the cool side. I'm going to pick maybe something warmer, right? And then I'll go over this time by selecting this little hint of a bubble. And I'm going to go on my highlights and create another color in here, right? I'm going to do something like this, still on the warmer side. Okay, so let's do that. And you can see how that begins to split all the tones, right? So a long time ago, it used to be called split toning. We have so much more control now. We have the highlights, the midtones. So it's not just the duality. We have 3 different ways of splitting those tones. Now that we've done that, that's a really cool gradient in itself. I'm enjoying it. I can definitely repurpose it, but this is of course just a representation of what will happen in your image. Your image may be a little bit harder to see where those shadows are, where those midtones are. We're seeing so much in our photos. Our photos already have so much representation. So this is one way to get a better understanding of how it works, right? So we have our midtones, our midtones in this warm tone, but I can see here the line is really, really direct, almost, it's not balancing quite well. It's not blending quite well. So I can always go down here into my blending mode, and you can start to see that when I move the slider over, it begins to blend that line. So it's not as, I guess, strict. So if you go over to your right-hand side, you can see that it is basically prioritizing the highlight color palette that you've selected. We've selected, in our case, a sort of pink fuchsia color. And in our shadows, if we go to our shadows, we've selected this blue, right? So if I bring the blending down to closer to the blue, it'll get closer to that blue hue. And the same thing happens with our balance. Okay. So I'm just gonna double click here, and that's going to reset it to the center. It's another really cool trick. It's good to know these very small elements so that your workflow gets a little bit faster. So that said, let's jump into one of our images. I'm going to actually go, in this case, into one of my images that I brought in that is already in black and white. So I want to show you what happens here. So I love exploring color a lot, but I also love bringing color into an image that doesn't have any color, and specifically by using the color grading tool. So let's try doing what we did on our demonstration and do it within this black and white image. So we have our version here, we have our original, and remember, we can always create a new version. So we'll do that in just a minute. All right, so I want to add a global hue on this one. I just want it to be, instead of black and white, I want it to be sort of this really cool, warm pink color. So I'm going to bring it in here. So now we have still that monochromatic look, but now it's this interesting, more vibrant color as opposed to just black and white. And it still kind of gives that same feeling of I'm not looking at anything else but maybe my subject and the elements around it. I think that's the really cool effect that happens whenever we take a black and white photo. It draws the attention directly into the elements that are in there because there aren't other distractions. I mean, in many ways, I think we understand that color theory in its sense has a lot of meaning, right? A red, a blue, all of these colors can denote a different emotion, right? This blue with his expression and his statement here, ningún ser humano es ilegal, no human is illegal. It can start bringing in that emotion of just contemplation, right? So I can choose to bring in a more vibrant color because, in fact, his statement is a positive one, is a statement of inspiration. So I can choose to change the emotion that gets drawn in here, as opposed to just having a black and white image that it does in fact neutralize any potential emotion, and all we see is the object. This is a different way to bring in a color and approach the same effect, but hinting in at one particular emotion that your viewer can leave with. So that same image is here in color, and I want to show you how I would affect this image without the global. Instead, I'm going to go into a specific tonal range. So I'm going to go into the shadows tonal range. I notice here that actually my tonal ranges are sort of muddy and it doesn't really have anything going on. If this was, even though it looks like a very perfectly set up set, we didn't have any other light source aside from this lantern here. So I think in retrospect, if we had a different light source, this could have been a really cool light implementation of maybe like a purple hue or something interesting like that. But instead, I get this really strange, muddy shadow. So let's rectify that. Let's add a little bit of maybe blue or purple into those hues. Now it looks like I actually came in here and added that lighting into my studio space, but this is done in post-production, which is a really cool thing to consider whenever you're shooting. If you don't have that hefty equipment, you can always come in here in post-production and try to create a brand new light condition for your image. So let's go into this image here. I'm going to move on to this image. Should we move on to this image? 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's go into this one. One of my favorite things here is to crop before I get started. So I'm going to do a quick little crop here just to eliminate some of those that strange vignetting that happens whenever I use my wide angle lens, right? So I'm just going to crop it in here, and also using the rule of thirds, I know that the crossing points are going to be the points of interest. So at least I have this crossing point here in the prop that the model is holding. So I like that. And I'm going to save this version and I'm going to call it cropped. Great. So now we have this option and then we have this option. Okay. I'm going to change the, okay, here we are. Color wheel. All right, so I'm going to change just the white balance here really quick. And another cool thing that I really appreciate is that whenever you browse over any section in Lightroom, it gives you a hint of what it's about. I think a long time when I started using Lightroom, it didn't have that in the interface, and I'm really grateful for that because it sort of encourages me to explore more of these panels and dive into it without going into too much of like research online. Okay, so back to the color grading. Let's go in here, and I can see it's really, really blue. And so I want to bring in a little bit of warmth to this image. Let's go into the crop version. Actually, let's close this. All right, so let's bring a little bit of warmth into some of my highlights. So let's see what this looks like. And if you are a fan of film color palettes, I encourage you to have some in hand. Maybe you have them on the side on your iPad or on your phone to just start to experiment. How can you create that effect without having to spend all the money? Although the practice, the craftsmanship in itself is a lot of fun, I do know that if you want to create some of these presets for yourself, oftentimes it's just a really cool way to just learn a tool by giving yourself that challenge of, hey, I'm a fan of film, let's try it out. So film oftentimes has this like really cool yellow hue or pink hues. It was this almost an imperfection in the film, right, in the ISO. So like it creates this sort of fuchsia on the highlights. So I'm going to imitate that there. On the midtones, I'm going to bring in a little bit of green, and on the shadows, I'm gonna maybe, let's see which one looks better here. A little bit of that red I think could look really cool. And that already looks really different, right, from how we had it before. Okay, so we're gonna jump into a little bit of blending here to make sure that that color that we just placed on top of our shadows, midtones, and highlights is blended with the image, so it looks a little bit more natural. It also kind of creates a sense of contrast within the highlights and shadows, both extreme points. And so I often like to take this step and not skip it. You can see how that sort of changes that color. And like I said before, this is a step in my workflow that oftentimes comes after doing a little bit of light retouching, doing a little bit of color, target adjustment, retouching, right? How we did yesterday and things like that. And in fact, it is in here almost after the color mixer and the white balance and all of that, almost for a reason. I think it's a hint in itself. So just consider that. I'm diving into this already, like just without doing any other edits. So these are sort of the results that happen. So consider doing a few of the other edits beforehand if you want a different result. Okay, so I feel like that looks really interesting. I'm going to create a version so that I can continue to experiment here. And I'm going to call it magic, just for fun. Oh, typo. Okay. So let's move on to another photo here. I like this photo because it has that gradient that we were talking about earlier. And I feel like that will be a good way to sort of explore how we can change the hues in this scene, which already look phenomenal, in my opinion. It was this is in Marfa, Texas, and it just basically gives the most beautiful sunrises and sunsets. So I encourage you guys to go visit. So this is going to be a good approach for that gradient element. Let's go into our shadows and start to play with how we can create a differentiation between this top area, right? This top half and the bottom half. Because at the moment, let me undo this. At the moment, everything's just sort of blending together. There's a lot of warmth in the bottom side, and we want to, our photos are 2D, but with these changes, what we often do is we help bring out or create some areas of hierarchy more than others, right? And we help bring out some things, some of the elements. So maybe the mountains and this car sort of riding through, even the bushes here, just to create some division. I think that often makes the image a bit more dimensional. So I'm going to go in here and do the opposite color. So I have a lot of warmth. I'm going to do a little bit of that blue again here. Maybe we can hint at a bit of teal so that we get that cool cinematic look we all love. So we can do that. Let's play with the luminance to see how much it affects it. I can start creating a bit of contrast here without jumping into my contrast mode, which is really interesting. Strike the balance. Oh, I think my mountains look a little bit more predominant here. So 20 is my lucky number there. And then let's go into the midtones and add a bit of that fuchsia. And wow, like already you can see how the mountains popped and they just look different. Now this looks like element 1, 2, and now we have element 3. Not everything isn't just blending together, and that's the magic of doing post-production. That's the artist's touch that is so encouraging when you're in Lightroom, and you can just play around with different ways of experimenting with your color palettes. So that looks really awesome. I'm already loving that. Let's go into our highlights and see what can happen. You can see most of the highlights sort of live here in this area. So let's see what would happen if I add a little bit of green. So keep an eye on that one. A little bit of pink. That's beautiful, right? It's a really great way to just modify your sunsets and sunrises. For example, an experience I've had in the past is I didn't dial in my ISO correctly. I maybe had a different picture profile on my Sony because I'm often switching from video to photography. So my colors were completely desaturated, a nightmare. And then I realized, well, I have post-production. I can always come into color grading and bring back some colors that really remind me of that sunrise or sunset that I saw in real life. So this is, at the end of the day, a camera, a tech, and my eye and my memory can be reflected in my post-production. So let's go to this image here and do one final touch on our color grading and see how we can modify this color. I love all the colors that live in this one. Let's add a little bit of shadow into the greens, the green area here. And another rule that I like to kind of keep in mind, it's a rule worth breaking, but just a rule nonetheless, is if I started in my shadows here, maybe my highlights go into the opposite side of that color wheel, right? So if I started in green, I can go into the purple area. And I'm going to go into the light section really quick, and I think I'm going to increase the highlights so we have more tonal range to play with. And let's go into our midtones and add a little bit of warmth in this one. Okay, let's blend that together, make sure that's has a little bit of balance. I kind of love when images start to kind of get flooded with a color over another, especially something like a purple hue often brings in that degree of like romance into your images. Let's see how we can affect that green plant that is in the foreground. And now this is a rough cut here, but definitely a really interesting way to approach your images by just playing around with the color hues and also desaturating them if you want to. I'm always big on switching the what's popular, right? If we often saturate things, what would happen if we desaturate and bring down the luminance as opposed to more is more, right? Like sometimes a little bit less can create a whole different dynamic within your images. We'll do we'll do this final one just to play around, and I'm just gonna add a little bit of purple because we just said purple adds that level of romance into our images. And I feel like that alone added so much beauty to this image without going too heavy on post editing for those of you who love to be purist and add very little touches at the end. So I hope we got to explore a little bit more of the tools and you felt more inspired to experiment with your color palettes in Lightroom now with the color mixer and the color grading in your arsenal of tools. My name is Cyn Lagos. Thank you so much for joining me today and see you tomorrow at the same time. Enjoy the next stream.